We're tracking the rental housing market in Bozeman and the challenges in finding a balance between affordability and preservation as the city grows. For more on this issue, Bozeman freelancer Isabel Hicks joins me today via Zoom to talk about her in-depth report on this subject in the Montana Free Press. And first, Isabel, based on your research, describe the situation? What's happening right now?
Yeah, so in Bozeman, since the COVID-19 pandemic, rents have increased pretty significantly. We saw in early 2020, before COVID started, to 2022, there was about 17% increase in the cost of rent in Bozeman for your average two-bedroom rental. We are starting to see those rent increases slow down a little bit. From 2022 to 2023, there was just a 0.3% rent increase from that year to year. So time will tell if those increases will continue to skyrocket like we had seen in the early stages of COVID, or slow down a bit as we've seen in the last year or two. Yeah, and the slight dip in rent increases that we've been seeing, the city has attributed that to building more units. More units are coming online to the market. We've seen the vacancy rates of units go up pretty significantly since 2022, which means that the supply is starting to catch up with the demand, but still we'll be able to see, how that turns out in the next few years.
So what is the average rent right now? And what are we talking here? One bedroom, two bedroom?
Yeah, let me just make sure I give you the right number. Right now, typically for an average two-bedroom rent in Bozeman, it's about $2,000 a month. And that is in 2020, it was around 1,600. So about a $400 bump in those 2 years.
Well, in your report, you talked to a lot of renters out there. What did they tell you about the situation?
Sure. So things are, more expensive than they were just 4 years ago. A common theme that came up, a lot of people are spending about a third or half of their monthly income on rent. That's actually about half of Bozeman voters are spending that. That's actually about half of Bozeman renters are spending about a third or a half of their monthly income on rent. A lot of people just talked about working really hard, 2, 3 jobs just to make ends meet and not really having any savings at the end of the day to show for that. One source had mentioned, cramming multiple people into smaller houses just to make it work. Another source who I talked to, who is currently unhoused and living in her car, she talked about how application fees just within the housing search have become, a huge cost burden to people. She had spent hundreds of dollars just applying for housing. Often, application fees can be $25, $50 for every place you apply to, and a lot of the time you don't hear back. Another thing that is significant that came up, the city talked about, there's kind of been a cultural shift since COVID, and that some people who, maybe would have had the opportunity to be a homeowner based on how the market was, in 2019, they're now by default renters. And that is a big, cultural shift for the city, kind of that demographic change.
Oh, well, a lot going on with this. And of course, the city's looking for ways to provide affordable housing while also preserving the city's small town identity for the most part. And tell me about that. What are the biggest challenges you're finding in your research?
Yeah, it really is a big challenge for the city to try and strike a balance between affordable housing and community values. I think one thing that came up a lot, a big challenge is that the most affordable units are often denser built units, and they're often taller. And that often, comes in contrast with community values here. People really like seeing their mountain views and maybe don't want a multi-story apartment complex blocking that. People really like having their open space and, sprawling fields. And when you have to pack dense housing into that, that can be impacted. And another really interesting thing is parking accessibility. That's something that the city officials who I talked to stressed a lot. When you think about building downtown, a lot of the new developments that are being built, almost half of that lot size is a parking lot. And when you think about, how land consumptive that is, how if we didn't need a parking lot, we could put more housing there, but people do need to have accessible places to put their cars. That is a community value. So it is a big challenge to balance all of those things.
So what about solutions? What are you hearing about that?
Yeah, so one thing that the city has been doing to kind of incentivize more affordable housing, they have it's called the Affordable Housing Ordinance, is sort of how they have laid out different incentives for developers to build affordable housing. Those incentives, however, are allowing some deviations from city code in terms of height restrictions and required parking spaces. So it really is a challenge that the city is running into. The only way to incentivize these affordable developments is by allowing some leeway to deviate from, providing parking spots and keeping buildings under a certain height. And I think something that is pretty significant to point out, Bozeman used to have, instead of incentivizing developers to build affordable units, it used to be like a mandatory requirement for a set number of units to be affordable in new developments. That is, it was called inclusionary zoning, is what that policy was called. That is something that Bozeman did do to require more affordable units. But that practice, which also was widely used in Kalispell, was actually outlawed by the Montana legislature in 2021. The idea of banning that was, cutting regulations for developers would make it easier and quicker to increase the housing supply, but it did, kind of tie the hands a bit on what certain city policies can do to incentivize affordable housing or to require affordable housing. Unsure if that overturning that would be revisited in a future legislative session. Another thing in terms of solutions that came up, I also talked to some landlords in the city who were also struggling with the rising with the rising cost of living in Bozeman. It's kind of on both sides. The landlords who I spoke with, one of them was very intentional about keeping his units below market rate, but was kind of forced to raise the rent to much higher after his property taxes had increased. I think it was 65% in 2023 after, property appraisals. So that landlord had talked about a proposed policy about some property tax breaks for landlords who do rent their units below market rate. So that is an idea that I think there's interest in exploring farther. That could really
a lot of stuff going on with that. And some of this, it all when you talked about the incentives, of course, the development, the Guthrie comes to mind. Explain what's next with this.
Sure. So the Guthrie project was a proposed 5-story apartment building in midtown Bozeman. There were about 111 units that were being proposed, half of which would have been affordable below market rate units. And that developer had used those incentives in the affordable housing ordinance to build propose the design to be taller and have less parking than is normally required by the city. They use the deepest incentives, and actually no parking spots for this building would have been required. There was proposed to include 37. This is an area of Bozeman that, it's right by the Elm, a big concert venue. It's right by Whittier Elementary School, lots of other houses and apartments. And so residents had seen this proposal, saw, the lack of parking spots and height and size of this building, and really were quite outraged that this had even been proposed in their neighborhood. There's a lot of organization to go to city commission meetings where this proposal was being discussed, and they actually were able to shut it down. As of now, the city had denied the proposal as it was written, and the developer, after the city denied it, filed a lawsuit over the denial. That was about a few weeks ago, so we'll see what happens. But
yeah, so it does bring these incentives into before council to possibly change those, right?
So in addition to being, residents upset about the Guthrie project, they kind of looked at, the city policy that let this be proposed in the first place, which was the affordable housing ordinance. And a lot of the anger was directed at that ordinance itself. So it is currently being revised. That revision was definitely jump-started by the outrage over the Guthrie project. City officials are hoping to, just make some tweaks to the ordinance. And I was told that a new draft would be ready around December or early next year for review.
All right. Well, that's we will continue to follow this, and you will have more reports coming down the line then.
Sure. Yeah, I'm definitely planning to follow what happens with the affordable housing ordinance. And yeah, lots of people are working on this issue, so there'll be lots to continue reporting on.
We'll continue following you on this. Thank you so much, Isabel.
Thank you so much.